I was standing in the kitchen holding a glass of water I hadn't even taken a sip from when I heard my stepfather's voice carry clearly from the living room. He didn't know I was home. I had come back early from the studio still smelling like turpentine, my shoes caked with flecks of dried paint. It was supposed to be a quiet evening. Instead, I got a sentence that split my soul in two. Break her spirit. Then she'll obey. His voice was calm, cold, like he was giving instructions about breaking a horse. I didn't breathe. The air turned thick. My pulse thudded in my ears. And then, nothing. Not even a whisper. My mother said absolutely nothing. No gasp, no protest, no soft laugh trying to dismiss it. Just silence. That silence roared louder than his cruelty. This was the same woman who once stormed into my second-grade classroom to demand an apology after a teacher humiliated me in front of the class. She had fire then. She once said, "No one ever breaks my daughter." Now she sat in that same living room barely 20 feet away, letting a man speak about me like I was some animal to be broken, and she didn't say a single word. That silence shattered me more than anything Carl Benson had ever done. It told me everything I needed to know. I was alone in that house. I backed away slowly, careful not to let the floor creak, went downstairs to my room in the basement, locked the door, and sat motionless on the bed. My fingers were still clenched around the glass. I hadn't even realized I'd brought it with me. I set it down gently and just stared at the floor. No tears, no screams. Just silence mirroring hers. My body was still, but my mind was collapsing inward, folding in on itself like a dying star. He wanted to break me. She was going to let him. Maybe she already had. I thought of all the times she brushed the hair from my face when I was sick. All the nights she told me I was born to shine like my father. That woman was gone. She died quietly somewhere along the way and left behind this stranger who watched me suffer and called it peace. At 2 in the morning, I packed a duffel bag, a few clothes, my sketchbook, my father's old wristwatch, and his journal. He always said one day it would remind me who I was. I didn't leave a note, didn't look back. The night air slapped me with a cold so sharp it cut through my skin, but I didn't care. It was honest. It didn't pretend to love me while letting me rot inside. He wanted to break my spirit. He had no idea it was forged in silence, my mother's silence. My name is Elena Morgan. I'm 32 years old, and for most of my life I believed survival meant keeping quiet, keeping my head down, avoiding eye contact when things got tense, learning the rhythm of other people's anger so I could step aside before it hit me. I thought that made me strong. I thought that was resilience. I know now it was conditioning. Learned helplessness. The result of years spent under a roof where love had conditions and safety was temporary. Before Carl came into our lives, things were different. Not perfect, never perfect, but warm, safe. My dad, Jonathan Morgan, was a school counselor. He had this way of talking to people that made you feel like your words actually mattered. When I was little, he used to say I had an artist's soul. He would bring home blank notebooks and tell me to fill them with color. He never told me to be quiet. He never told me to be less. He died when I was 12, hit by a drunk driver on his way home from a parent-teacher conference. One minute he was texting my mom that he'd bring dessert. The next we were standing in a hospital room staring at a covered body that didn't look like anyone I recognized. That day broke something in both of us. But where I cried and clung to every memory of him like a life raft, my mom shut down. For the first few months, she went through the motions. Made dinner. Took me to school. Kissed my forehead goodnight, but her eyes were empty. And then came Carl. He was a decorated Marine, a motivational speaker at some school event. He had this charisma that made people lean in. My mother leaned in fast. They met in November. By March, he'd moved in. By June, they were married. The shift was subtle at first. He brought structure, which we both mistook for stability. I was a teenager, grieving and angry, and Carl treated that like defiance. He began correcting my posture, my tone, the way I asked for things. At first, I thought he was just strict, but structure became control. Curfews became lockdowns. Rules became punishments. Art became forbidden. "What kind of future do you think crayons are going to buy you?" he once snapped when he found me sketching. My mother, once the woman who framed my childhood drawings, stood beside him silent. Maybe she thought this was love. Maybe she thought it was discipline. All I knew was that every time I expressed myself, I lost something. I lost privacy. I lost freedom. Eventually, I lost the right to choose my own college. I had dreamed of studying art in Boston, but Carl refused. Out-of-state tuition for finger painting. He laughed in my face. My mom barely whispered, "Maybe he's right." That night, I cried until I couldn't feel my face. I ended up majoring in business at a local college he approved of. My friends stopped coming around. He called them distractions. My clothes changed, my words changed, and every time I opened my mouth, I questioned whether it was worth the consequences. This was how he broke me slowly, piece by piece, not with fists, but with rules, with ridicule, with the certainty that I could never be enough for the family he was trying to reshape in his image, and my mother let it happen. That was the cost of staying in that house. That was the price of love with conditions. I learned how to make myself smaller. I thought that was the only way to survive, until the day I heard him say it out loud, "Break her spirit." That was the day I remembered what my father used to say: "You were not born to shrink. You were born to burn." And that was the moment I decided to stop surviving and start escaping. Carl Benson didn't hit me, not with fists anyway. If he had, maybe it would have been easier to explain. Maybe someone would have believed me sooner. But bruises on the soul don't photograph well. And emotional abuse rarely comes with police reports. It comes with questions you ask yourself late at night like, "Am I really this difficult?" Or, "Maybe I did overreact." It comes with a silence that eats you alive because you can't even trust your own feelings anymore. That was the kind of house I grew up in. My mother, Linda, changed more rapidly than I expected. After marrying Carl, she quit her job as a librarian, a position she used to say gave her purpose. "Carl says I don't need to work," she told me one morning over breakfast, smiling in a way that didn't reach her eyes. "He wants me to relax." But relaxing turned into retreating, into shrinking, into nodding in agreement with everything he said, even when it made no sense. Our house, once filled with books and music, became quieter, cleaner, more organized, but also more sterile, more lifeless. My room was moved to the basement for privacy, Carl said. But it always felt like exile. I was 17. Most of my friends were planning college visits and part-time jobs. I was memorizing Carl's moods and walking on eggshells. My mother started parroting his lines. "He only wants what's best for you. Art isn't a real career. Why can't you just be grateful?" I began to feel like a guest in my own home. The kitchen was off limits after 9 p.m. My internet was monitored. Every conversation felt like a test I didn't study for. And the punishment wasn't grounded weekends, it was shame. Cold silences. Dinners where no one looked at me. Carl once threw my sketchbook in the trash because I drew a woman with a bruised face. "What is this? Some sort of attack on me?" he barked. I looked to my mother for defense. She looked away. That moment stays with me more vividly than anything. Not because of the sketchbook, but because of how easily she abandoned me in that second. That's when I knew. Carl wasn't the only problem. The problem was the way my mother absorbed his energy, his rules, his worldview, and passed them down to me like gospel. She became his amplifier, not my advocate. There were times, small slivers of moments when I caught glimpses of the mother I used to know, like when she found a doodle of mine tucked in a book and smiled faintly before tucking it in her pocket, or when I got sick and she stayed by my bed for hours brushing hair from my forehead like she used to when I was little. But those moments vanished the second Carl entered the room. Her spine straightened. Her smile vanished. She became his shadow. I began to understand that she wasn't just controlled, she had adapted to his control, like a plant bending toward the only available light, even if that light burned her. She'd been through her own grief, her own loss. I tried to hold space for that, but it's hard to hold space for someone who won't even acknowledge your pain. And when someone won't protect you, especially when they are the only person who should you stop waiting to be saved, you start planning your own escape. That house wasn't just toxic. It was a quiet factory where hope was dismantled in stages, where voices went to die, and I knew if I stayed, mine would be next. By the time I turned 20, the house no longer felt like a home. It was a battleground wrapped in expensive wallpaper and tension so thick it clung to your skin. Carl had taken full control of everything finances rules, even how much time I could spend outside the house. He monitored my schedule under the guise of safety and made it clear that my future would align with his expectations, not mine. I was studying business at the local college, just as he dictated, and working part-time at a bookstore, one of the only places I felt human. Art, my true love, had been reduced to stolen moments in my basement room sketching by flashlight when I couldn't sleep. He didn't know I still drew. I kept everything hidden in a box beneath loose floorboards, afraid he might destroy it all if he ever found it. But hiding wasn't just physical anymore, it had seeped into my personality. I spoke less, laughed less, smiled only in public where the illusion of normalcy had to be maintained. At home, every interaction was a minefield. One misplaced word and the air would shift. My mother's eyes would dart to Carl, waiting to see how he'd respond. I'd watch her tense like prey, sensing a predator, and I hated her for it. Hated her for being so afraid that she let him poison everything between us. The fights began as whispers behind closed doors. Carl would question me about my tone, my attitude, the disrespect he claimed I dripped with. He called me ungrateful, lazy, spoiled. He said I was a failure compared to his friends' daughters who had all gone into law or accounting. "You think the world owes you something because your daddy died," he once spat during a dinner I tried to excuse myself from. My fork clattered against my plate. I looked to my mother, begging for her to say something, but she just stared at her food, her shoulders hunched. The silence between us became the loudest betrayal. That night I cried so hard I tore the pages of my sketchbook trying to draw through the pain. The more I resisted, the tighter Carl's grip became. He demanded passwords to my phone and laptop. If I refused, he threatened to disconnect the Wi-Fi or take away my car keys. Once he accused me of sneaking out even though I hadn't left the house in days and told my mother, "She's pushing boundaries. That needs to stop." And my mother, the same woman who once told me that no one owns your life but you, nodded and whispered, "I'll talk to her." But she never did. One afternoon while I was out at the bookstore, Carl came into my room. He found the hidden compartment under the floorboards. I knew because when I returned, my sketchbook was missing. Gone. My private world of expression of survival had been erased. I ran upstairs breathless and found him in the living room holding it. My drawings spilled across his lap, portraits of faceless women trapped behind glass self-portraits cracked down the middle. "So this is what you do instead of focusing on your future," he sneered. "You draw yourself crying pathetic." I lunged toward him, not thinking, just reacting. He pulled the sketchbook away and tore out a page, one of my favorites, and crumpled it slowly while staring me down. I turned to my mother, heart pounding, desperate. "Say something," I whispered. She looked between us. Her lips moved slightly as if she were about to speak, but then she stopped. Her eyes softened with guilt, but not enough to stop him, not enough to protect me. That was the day something broke in me. Not like before. This time it was clean, precise, like a bone finally snapping after being strained too long. I stopped begging. I stopped hoping. I started counting the days until I could leave. That night, I went to sleep in a room that had been stripped of everything I cared about. But instead of crying, I stared at the ceiling, planning my exit. I knew now that he wouldn't stop, not until I had nothing left. And she wouldn't stop him. Not even when he called it discipline. Not even when he called it love. The final blow came on a Thursday afternoon just after I finished a shift at the bookstore. I had been saving for months, hiding away $20 here, $15 there, and a false bottom inside a hollowed-out textbook from the clearance bin. It was barely enough for a deposit on a studio apartment, but it was something my exit fund. I had also been researching my father's old bank accounts, trying to find out what happened to the small inheritance he left me in a trust when he died. He wasn't wealthy, but he had always been careful. He once told me when I was 10, "This is for your future. You'll need wings someday." But every time I asked my mother about the trust, she brushed me off. Carl handles that stuff now. It's being reinvested, she'd say, avoiding eye contact. That day, I stopped by the credit union where my father had originally opened the account. I expected red tape, maybe a few forms. What I got was far worse. "I'm sorry," the woman behind the desk said after typing my information into the computer. That account was closed 2 years ago, transferred to a joint account under Linda and Carl Benson. I stared at her. There must be a mistake. That money was in a trust. It should have stayed untouched until I was 25. She shook her head gently. "The paperwork here shows full consent from the legal guardian. It was liquidated and moved into another account. I'm afraid there's nothing here anymore." My stomach dropped. My face burned. I walked out of the bank feeling like my skin no longer fit my body. When I got home, I confronted my mother. I waited until Carl was in the garage, fiddling with tools or pretending to be productive as he often did. "Why did you let him take it?" I asked. My voice was calm, too calm. "What are you talking about?" she said, folding laundry at the kitchen table. "Dad's trust. The money he left for me. It's gone. And it went into your joint account." Her hands froze mid-fold. She didn't look up. "We needed it," she said quietly. "For what?" "For the house. For bills. For Lily's education." "Lily's 5, I snapped. "That money was never for her. It was for me. Dad made that clear. And you let him take it." She finally looked at me. There was guilt in her eyes, but also something worse, resignation. "You were a minor. I did what I thought was best." "You did what Carl told you to do," I said. "You gave away the last thing Dad left me." "Carl knows how to manage money. He's been good to us." The words made me dizzy. "Good to us," I whispered. "Do you even hear yourself?" I walked away before I said something I couldn't take back, but something inside me was already gone. That night, I sat on the cold basement floor and stared at the empty space where my sketchbook used to be. I thought about everything I had lost, my art, my voice, my future, my father's legacy. And then I thought about the words Carl had said in the living room just days before. Break her spirit, that was his mission, and it was working. But he hadn't won yet, not completely, not if I still had the strength to leave. I knew I couldn't wait much longer. My money was limited, and now I had no inheritance to fall back on. I began selling pieces of my old artwork online under a pseudonym, trying to scrape together whatever I could. I took extra shifts at the bookstore. I asked Julia, a friend from college I had lost touch with, thanks to Carl's isolation tactics, if she still had that spare room she used to complain about. She did, and she didn't hesitate. "Come stay," she said. "You don't even have to explain." That was the first kindness I'd received in months that didn't come with strings. I didn't tell my mother I was leaving. Not this time, because by then I knew she wouldn't stop me. And worse, she wouldn't care. Julia's apartment was a small second-floor walk-up with peeling paint and uneven floors, but to me it felt like a palace. It smelled like candles and coffee and freedom. The first night I slept there, I didn't wake up to footsteps overhead or whispered arguments through thin walls. I didn't wake up at all until noon the next day. Julia didn't ask for explanations right away. She gave me space. She cooked pasta and left wine on the table and said, "When you're ready, I'm here." It was the first time in years I felt seen without being evaluated. Over the next few weeks, I started rebuilding slowly, one piece at a time. I took more shifts at the bookstore, applied for freelance design gigs online, and opened a savings account in my own name. Julia introduced me to her friend Megan, a counselor at a local women's resource center. Megan was sharp-eyed, warm-voiced, and didn't flinch when I told her about Carl. "That's coercive control," she said plainly. "Classic isolation gaslighting financial abuse. You're not crazy. You've been trained to doubt yourself." Her words cracked something open in me. For so long, I had carried shame like a second skin. To hear someone else describe my experience in clinical terms objectively made me feel less alone. Megan also recommended I speak to a legal advisor. She connected me with Thomas, a lawyer who worked pro bono for the center. I was hesitant at first. What was the point? The money was already gone. The damage was done. But Thomas took one look at the paperwork I had gathered from the credit union and said, "You may have a case." I blinked. A case. "It's not just about the trust fund," he said. "If your father's will specified that the funds were to be used only for you, and if Carl accessed them through manipulation or forgery, that's potentially fraud, especially if your mother was coerced." "She wasn't coerced," I said bitterly. "She gave it to him willingly." Thomas looked at me carefully. "Even so, if she was misled or didn't understand the legal implications, she might still be considered a manipulated party. This isn't black and white, but we'll need evidence." That night, I emailed my father's old attorney, Mr. Raines, someone I barely remembered meeting as a child. To my surprise, he responded quickly. "I remember your father fondly," he wrote. "He was very clear about wanting to protect your future. Let's talk." The next day, we met over video call. He confirmed that the original will stated the trust was to remain untouched until I turned 25 unless an emergency required limited disbursements for health or education. But I never approved anything I said, and I was never notified. He frowned. "That's a serious breach." He agreed to send me scanned copies of the original documents and offered to speak with Thomas. Slowly, a case was building. Meanwhile, I kept working. I created a small online portfolio under a pseudonym, and to my surprise, some of my digital art began selling. Nothing major, just Etsy-level commissions, but it felt like forward movement. Julia cheered every sale like I'd won a national prize. For the first time, I began to imagine a life where I didn't have to ask permission to exist. One night, Megan called me after hours. "Are you safe?" she asked. "Yes," I said, startled. "Why?" "Because someone broke into our center today. They didn't take anything, but your file was disturbed." I froze. "You think it was Carl?" "We can't prove it, but be careful." Julia and I checked the locks. We installed a second deadbolt. I started looking over my shoulder, but more than afraid, I was angry. He was still trying to reach into my life, still trying to silence me. I wasn't going to let him, and I wasn't alone anymore. That changed everything. The day I decided to stop hiding, something shifted inside me. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't cinematic. It was quiet, firm, like the final click of a lock after years of turning the wrong key. I started with the truth. I began documenting everything: emails, voicemails, text messages from my mother, copies of bank statements, even journal entries from the past that could establish a timeline of abuse. Thomas was meticulous. He coached me on how to request records legally and how to protect myself from retaliation. I filed for a restraining order not because Carl had physically hurt me, but because the threat was real and present. The file break-in at the Women's Center proved that. It gave us leverage. Next, we gathered witness statements. Julia wrote about the emotional state I was in when I first moved in, how I flinched at raised voices, how I couldn't sleep, how I'd go still whenever someone knocked on the door. Megan, as a licensed counselor, submitted a report affirming coercive control and emotional trauma. Mr. Raines provided a formal statement about the trust fund's original stipulations and the irregularity of its liquidation. Then came the part I was most afraid of going public. At Thomas's recommendation, I contacted a local journalist who specialized in family legal cases and survivors of abuse. I used my real name. I included excerpts from my art drawings I had recreated from memory, each one telling a piece of the story: the girl behind glass, the shadow of the stepfather, the mother with disappearing eyes. The article went live within a week. It wasn't sensational, but it was raw, honest, and backed by documentation. It got shared, then reshared. The comments poured in, some supportive, some cruel, but overwhelmingly people recognized the pattern. They had lived it too. A local podcast invited me to speak about financial and emotional abuse, and though my voice trembled through half the interview, I got through it. I spoke not just for me, but for every woman who ever felt crazy for reacting to being diminished. Meanwhile, Carl was unraveling. We learned that he had quietly tried to withdraw funds from the joint account again, likely trying to hide assets. But since the case was now under legal review, the bank had frozen suspicious transactions. Word began to spread in his professional circles. His speaking gigs dried up, his consultancy contracts were put on hold. Carl sent my mother to reach out. First through a text, "He's sorry, he wants to talk." Then a voicemail, "Maybe we all made mistakes, but this doesn't have to get ugly." I didn't respond. Neither did Thomas. We stayed the course. 2 weeks later, Carl was served with a subpoena to appear in court for financial fraud and misappropriation of a protected trust. Linda was named as a party to the case. I didn't feel triumph. I felt grief. My mother wasn't just someone who failed to protect me. She had actively helped the man who tried to erase me. I didn't want revenge. I wanted accountability. I wanted my story to be real, not just to me, but in the eyes of the law. The court date was set. The closer it came, the more I felt myself returning to the girl I used to be, the one who filled notebooks with color and believed she had a voice worth hearing. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was fighting back with everything I had, with facts, with art, with witnesses, with law. I was using every tool Carl had tried to convince me I didn't deserve. And every day I got a little stronger. Every day his shadow got a little smaller. I didn't need him to break down. I didn't need an apology. I needed the world to see that what he did wasn't discipline. It was abuse. What she allowed wasn't parenting. It was betrayal. And what I was doing now, it wasn't vengeance. It was reclamation of money, of truth, of myself. The day of the court hearing arrived cloaked in gray skies and a sharp wind that cut through my coat, but I welcomed the cold. It kept me focused. The courthouse was unremarkable, just glass steel and tired fluorescent lights, but to me it was a cathedral. Not because I believed justice was perfect, but because it was the first place in years where my voice would be more than a scream into silence. Carl arrived in a navy suit that didn't quite fit anymore. He looked thinner, older, but no less smug. He barely glanced at me as he passed, his jaw tight, his posture rigid with practiced control. My mother followed 2 steps behind, eyes down, shoulders hunched. She looked like a ghost of the woman who once braided my hair before school. I didn't say hello, neither did she. Inside the courtroom, everything was sterile: papers, shuffling people, murmuring, the judge tapping a pen with bored precision. But when Thomas stood to present our case, the room shifted. He spoke calmly, clearly laying out the timeline of the trust fund's creation, the intended purpose of the money, the conditions under which it could be accessed, and the irregularities in how it was closed. Mr. Raines had provided signed documentation showing my father's intentions. Thomas introduced the counselor's report, my statement, and Julia's affidavit. Then he presented the evidence of forged consent forms and suspicious banking activity. Carl's lawyer tried to counter by arguing implied consent, financial necessity, and family agreement, but the facts were solid. Carl had withdrawn money from a restricted account without legal authority. He had not disclosed the purpose of the funds, and worse, he had used part of it for personal expenses unrelated to household needs. The judge asked my mother to speak. She hesitated, then walked to the front, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't read the papers," she said. "Carl told me everything was fine. I believed him. I thought it was legal. I didn't think—" Her voice cracked. "I didn't think it mattered anymore." The judge nodded, expression unreadable. "That's not how trusts work, Mrs. Benson." Then they called me to the stand. My heart was a war drum in my chest, but I walked forward anyway. I told the truth. About the house, the control, the silence. About being 17 and knowing that crying would only make it worse. About watching my mother fade and learning not to take up too much space. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just told the story as it happened. The court was quiet. Even Carl looked away. When the ruling came, it wasn't dramatic. The judge ordered Carl to repay the misappropriated funds plus damages. He was also referred for investigation on fraud charges, which could lead to criminal proceedings. My mother was not criminally charged, but the judge noted her negligence and recommended counseling. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited. The story had gained traction after the article and podcast. I gave a short statement, careful but firm. This was never about money. This was about voice. And no one has the right to silence someone else, not with threats, not with control, and not with a pen and a signature. Carl left quickly, avoiding cameras. My mother stayed behind. She looked at me, really looked at me for the first time in years. Her eyes were red. I didn't know how to stop him, she whispered. You didn't even try, I answered. She reached out, but I didn't move. She let her hand fall. I'm sorry, she said. I know that's not enough. It wasn't, but it was something. Carl's life changed rapidly after that. He lost his position on a local nonprofit board. Speaking engagements dried up. His face started appearing in articles not as a mentor, but as a cautionary tale. He tried to disappear quietly, but the internet doesn't forget. I didn't celebrate his fall. I wasn't interested in watching him burn. I was only interested in the fact that finally he couldn't touch me anymore. He had taken almost everything from me. Almost. But not my strength, not my art, and not my voice. That I had reclaimed, publicly, legally, permanently. After the court ruling, I moved into a small studio apartment just outside the city. It wasn't much creaky floors, second-hand furniture windows that leaked during storms, but it was mine. Every inch of it was mine. I painted the walls in soft earth tones, hung string lights over my tiny desk, and taped sketches to every corner. The first night I slept there, I woke up in the middle of the night not from fear or footsteps or tension, but from a dream where I was laughing. I hadn't done that in years. Freedom felt foreign at first. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was the quiet certainty that no one could take away my space or tell me who I was anymore. I kept going to therapy. Megan introduced me to a support group for adult survivors of family control, and for the first time I heard echoes of my own story in other voices. One woman had been financially trapped for decades. Another had been silenced by cultural guilt. We all had different details, but the same thread: we were taught to survive, not to thrive. Slowly, I began to unlearn that. I rebuilt my online art presence under my real name this time. I told my story through a series of digital paintings, abstract pieces filled with fractured shapes and hidden figures, pieces about grief, betrayal, control, and rebirth. I called the collection The House That Hurt Me. I never expected it to gain traction, but people connected with it. Orders started coming in. A small gallery reached out about hosting a showing. It felt surreal, like something out of someone else's life. Julia came to the opening night, eyes shining with pride. So did Megan. Even Thomas made an appearance out of his usual suit, wearing a wool sweater and looking slightly out of place among the canvases. But the person I didn't expect to see was my mother. She stood in the back near the doorway, clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers. For a moment, I didn't know what to do. The gallery was loud, full of conversation and clinking glasses, but between us there was silence. Then she stepped forward. I saw your interview, she said quietly. The one where you said your voice is something no one can take again. I kept thinking, I took it too. I let him. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. She looked at the painting nearest to us, an abstract of a woman walking away from a burning house. That one's you, right? I nodded. She handed me the flowers. I'm in therapy now, she said. I'm trying. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I hope someday you'll think about it. I looked at her, really looked, and saw a flicker of the mother I used to know, the one who read to me at bedtime, who taped my drawings to the fridge, who once stood up for me in front of a whole classroom. That version of her was buried deep, but not gone. I didn't forgive her then, not fully. But I told her she could come back slowly on my terms. We agreed to meet for coffee once a month. No pressure, no pretending, just honesty. That was all I asked. And for the first time she said yes without looking to someone else for permission. That was the moment I knew I was no longer the girl trying to survive someone else's house. I had built my own. The final piece in my gallery show was titled Inheritance. It wasn't large or colorful. It was stark black ink on raw canvas, with the faint outline of a girl standing alone, her shadow reaching behind her like a tangled web of hands pulling her down. But the girl's feet weren't rooted. They were stepping forward. It was the last painting I completed for the show, and the hardest, because it forced me to ask a question I had been avoiding. What am I carrying forward? What legacy do I leave behind? Not just as an artist, but as a woman who broke free. I used to think that surviving meant escaping, getting out, cutting ties, burning bridges, and sometimes it does. But real healing means more than distance. It means ending the cycle, not replicating what hurt you, not hiding what broke you, not pretending it never happened. I speak now. That's the biggest difference. I speak when something feels wrong. I speak when I feel unsafe. I speak when I see someone else being silenced, and I teach others to do the same. I started holding workshops for young women in the community free sessions at the center where Megan worked using art as a tool for storytelling and survival. We don't just paint, we talk, we unravel, we rebuild. And every time a girl tells me I thought it was just me, I tell her it never is. That's the message I wish someone had told me when I was 17 and sitting in a cold basement wondering if I was going crazy. It's the message I built my new life around. One night after a workshop, I found a note tucked under the windshield wiper of my car. It was from my mother. She had written, "I saw your girls today. They're lucky to have you. I'm proud of you." I don't say it enough. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it mattered, because it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about me, my choices, my values, my peace. I still carry scars. Not all of them are visible, but they're no longer signs of weakness. They're proof I survived something I wasn't supposed to. Proof that my voice, once buried under silence and shame, now echoes in rooms that used to scare me. If you are reading this, if you're in a house that whispers to you that you are small, unworthy, a burden, know this: you are not the problem. The problem is the silence that has wrapped itself around your truth. Break it. Speak it, paint it, scream it, name it. That's how the cycle ends. Not with perfect closure, not with everyone apologizing, but with one person saying, "It stops with me. I was that person and I still am."